What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a guide to all of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous's DLC. Specifically, its paid DLC, the 6 premium bits that add significant chunks of content to the game, though it's probably worth a mention that there are a handful of free DLCs as well, but those are mostly just smaller quests and the like. But with this video, I aim to do 2 things. Tell you when to play each, or what the best rough time frame is to complete them, where they fit into the main story, etc. And I figured on top of that I would also go ahead and rank them at the same time, because I certainly do have my favorites. So first up, I'm going to go over these in the order of which I like the most, or least to most I should say, explaining what the DLC is while also telling you when you should play it and what it adds to the main campaign, as oftentimes even the standalone DLCs that have their own story also add things to the main campaign like items. And then at the end of the video, which should be timestamped, I'll give a brief summary of when to play each if that's all you're interested in. But with that exact thing in mind, let's go ahead and kick this off with my least favorite of all of the DLCs, which is, in fact, the very first one they put out, which was Inevitable Excess. This DLC takes place literally just before the last boss fight. However, completing it does give you a bunch of stuff for the main game, especially for replays, which I would say is more what those bonuses are aimed at. So don't feel like you have to play this before you play the rest of the game or anything, but this entire DLC takes place literally just before you enter the room with the last boss, and that is because you are called away by what is called an Inevitable, specifically named Valmalos, to help take care of a problem. And in doing so, we get brought to the plane of Axis, which is the birthplace and home of the Inevitables. Now, I won't spoil the campaign, obviously, but it's important to note that this is a very high-level campaign. That is to say, max level and max mythic rank, which means the point of this DLC is to give you an opportunity to use your powers to their fullest, as otherwise the game gives you your very last mythic rank, which is a secondary progression power, literally just a few fights before the end of the game as well. Now, the reason this one is my least favorite is simply because I just don't think the story of it is that strong, and the exploration side of it hinges on a lot of different little puzzles that I didn't really have a ton of fun with personally. However, I do think it's absolutely worth playing through, if only for the rewards to the main campaign if you plan on replaying the game. So to start with, once you've completed this DLC at least once, you'll gain access to the Inevitable Fate ability for your future and current campaigns for every save after the first act of the game. So any character you make or have made after you beat this will get an ability called Inevitable Fate, which is an incredibly strong once-a-day buff that lasts for 10 minutes. This becomes available right as you gain access to your mythic powers at the end of Act 1. What's more, though, is that there's a secret boss in the DLC, and if you beat that secret boss in this DLC on up to hard mode, you'll actually gain access to some rifts in the base game that will grant you powerful items, well before you would realistically get something at that point. There's 3 of these scattered throughout the game, which you'll find right at the start of Act 2 in a companion area, the first dungeon of Act 4 called the Midnight Fane, and the last dungeon of Act 4 right before you come back. But what's more, actually, this also has a Mythic Path specific reward. Basically, if you complete Inevitable Excess as a Lich, you'll gain access to a special item as well, a helmet that you'll gain access to in Act 5 in future playthroughs. So while Inevitable Excess is my least favorite, it does add a ton of little stuff to the main game that's definitely worth it on a replay. But due to its position and where it takes place just before the last boss, which means jumping into it for a first playthrough before you've actually played through the campaign, requiring you to just instantly take control of max level characters, means this isn't really one to start with. So I would think of these rewards more as something for a replay of the game. Now that brings us to number 5, obviously, and I will say that I like pretty much everything from this point onwards, and number 5, Treasure of the Midnight Isles, does a lot of cool things. I just think the DLCs above this one are cooler overall, because Treasure of the Midnight Isles is all at once a standalone roguelike mode, but also a big dungeon added to Act 5 of the game. In both cases, you'll be sailing across the islands of the Dark Abyss, where you can enjoy a mostly self-contained story about the treasure of the Midnight Isles, as you might imagine. Now, the standalone roguelike portion of this one is fantastic for spitballing your way through builds. So if you've ever struggled with character creation and wondered what build you should go with, this DLC is actually a great way to try that out because the standalone mode allows you to quickly churn through builds and level them up at an exponentially faster rate than is available in the main campaign, while also actually testing them against enemies properly. And you can even get mythic power this way. So if you're the kind of person who agonizes over that kind of thing, this is a great way to trial and error your way through it to find something you like. This does also give us access to essentially the same dungeon setup, but very much so condensed in the main game as well in Act 5. You'll be called to a place nearby to explore this dungeon, and while it's a much smaller version than the roguelike, it's still a very large dungeon which comes with a ton of unique rewards and allows you to experience the story of it at the same time. So overall, I think this is a great addition to the game. I just wouldn't consider it my personal favorite. Which brings us to the number 4 slot though, and this is the Last Sarkorians. Now, of all of the DLC, I would say this one is one you should absolutely pick up. And that is because it affects the entire game, basically, from Act 1 to the end, and that is because it essentially adds a new companion in the form of Olbrig. Olbrig is a shifter, which is a class this DLC also adds to the game for you, which is a more martially focused druid. If you have this DLC, you can meet Olbrig as early as Act 1, and he has all new content and storylines to experience all throughout the entirety of the game. It's very good stuff. The shifter is a fantastic class, one of my favorites actually. So that DLC is definitely worth it just for the amount of content it adds directly to the main story and this new companion you can encounter, who's even romanceable if you want that. But that brings us to the top 3, starting a little bit out of order here with Lord of Nothing. Lord of Nothing is a standalone campaign from the main title, however, it's also technically a follow-up from my number 1 spot, which we'll get to in just a moment. In Lord of Nothing, though, we can choose to continue from the first DLC or simply make some new characters, and we will be controlling a sort of ragtag group of individuals trying to fight their way through a handful of scenarios centered around weakening the forgotten demon lord Sethud. A lot of these little scenarios that you'll be fighting through are really well done. I enjoyed them a lot. And there's actually a secondary power progression system sort of adjacent to the mythic power system that I think adds a really fun thing to mess around with. But also, this little DLC has multiple endings that will affect the main game as well, because you can import your save from the Lord of Nothing into the main game and see the effects of it during Act 5. Because depending on your choices and the outcome here, you'll get a new quest and a new dungeon in Act 5 that then becomes explorable, obviously. But what's more is you will face a boss as a result of this, and the strength of that boss depends on the actions you took in the DLC. Which is important to mention because I would say the more powerful version of this boss is, in my opinion at least, the hardest fight in the game. It's truly a spectacle. It's like a 10-phase boss fight. It was incredible. And while that obviously comes with its own rewards, it being a demon lord is also important because that gains you access to a special resource that you'll need for the secret ending, or at least it can potentially do so. But believe it or not, that's not all. Another reason you might want to pick up this DLC is the 15 new archetypes or class subtypes that this DLC also adds to the game, some of which were really, really cool. So if you wanted to buy this one and play it and experience it in the main game, you would simply want to play through this one sometime before or during Act 5 of your main playthrough, and then you'll be able to import that save, which should pop up right as you load your main save file, and then you can experience that content for yourself, beyond just the standalone portion. Now that brings us to our number 2 entry, and this was the last relatively recently released DLC called A Dance of Masks. Now this is effectively a Mass Effect style of DLC, as it is essentially just a big last hurrah for your companions that takes place during a festival in the rebuilt city of Canabris, where you start the game at. As such, this one directly affects the main game because it's set entirely during it, and it's really more about celebrating your companions and the journey that you went through to get to the end of the game, because this particular DLC takes place right before you head off to the final dungeon, which is sometimes referred to as Act 6. So basically, when you're ready to finish Act 5 is when this will become available to you. During this festival, every single one of your companions that you can actually take with you, which will obviously vary a bit depending on in-game events, will have their own little quest and dialogue for you. Any of the companions that you've romanced will have a unique romance scene specific to this DLC that is also a bit of a send-off to your characters. And there's even an arena where you can engage in a little bit of combat, though obviously that's not the focus of this one. So all of that is great. It comes with new items and rewards. There's vendors at the festival that sell some unique magical items, but obviously they'll only be of use for the last dungeon. But a big reason you might want to pick up this DLC as well is that this one added 11 new archetypes to the game. Some really popular ones, in fact, one I'm enjoying a ton myself is Kinetic Sharpshooter, but that's neither here nor there. So this DLC, I think if you're actually planning on completely finishing the game, is essentially mandatory because of what it adds to the title. However, that brings me to my number one spot, which is Through the Ashes. My personal favorite DLC, but admittedly the one that probably adds the least to the base game. This is a standalone campaign that takes place alongside Act 1, meaning that it is happening at the same time. Because whereas your main hero, the Knight Commander of the 5th Crusade, goes on an epic journey about mythic power, Through the Ashes is a very different experience. You actually play relatively ordinary citizens who just happen to be caught up in the demonic invasion. Your goal is less to overcome the invasion and rather just to survive while making your way to a place called the Defender's Heart, which is a tavern. And instead of feeling incredibly powerful like you do all through the base game, you're dealing with a ragtag team of people just doing their best to survive, and they're not really in a great position to do so. But while I love the tone and how this one works, there's a few important things to know about it before you play it. For starters, it doesn't really add much to the base game like everything else does. But also, this one is meant to be a little bit of a struggle, which means that resources and things are limited in game, and playing classes and archetypes for it that depend on a very specific weapon type is probably a bad idea because you're not likely to find any of them, which means you'll likely want to stick to classes that are less specific about things they'll be able to use and find. So because of those things, this one isn't generally favorably regarded, but I really enjoyed it because of the contrast it brought to the main campaign while sticking to its main themes. But do keep in mind this one is, by its very nature and intended purpose, quite a bit more unforgiving than the rest. Now, while I say this one adds next to nothing to the main game, that is true, but technically you do actually get at least one thing, and that is if you have completed this DLC before the attack on the Defender's Heart in the main campaign, you'll have a chance to import that save, and after the attack is over, provided you won, you'll gain an extra item that can be particularly useful for mages and casters who want to use cold damage specifically, which is extremely niche but is technically a thing, so there it is. So that's been a look at all the DLCs, what they do, what they're all about, when it's best to play them, and to that end, just to kind of summarize it up here at the end and provide a convenient timestamp for people to arrange them in a little more chronological order, let's say. If you buy all the DLC and you want to play them in order and know what to experience, basically it goes like this. Before you complete Act 1, specifically before the attack on the Defender's Heart in Act 1, you might want to run through the Ashes, though technically speaking this does not actually add anything into the main campaign, but seeing how the characters from this are then able to be imported into its follow-up, Lord of Nothing, you might want to do it if only just for that. But the rewards from this one are minimal for the main campaign. Now next up we have the Last Sarkorians. Because this one takes place over the entire course of the game, right from Act 1, you'll likely want to pick this one up as a sort of mandatory addition if you're looking to experience everything. It adds a new companion, a new storyline, new locations, new enemies, etc. One of the better ones to get for sure. Now the next three all mainly take place in Act 5. We have Treasures of the Midnight Isle, which has a completely standalone mode, but also adds an entire big sort of mega dungeon really to the main campaign with all sorts of loot and things to experience. So while great if you want more content, it's mostly just a standalone dungeon. But then we have the other two, starting with Lord of Nothing. Lord of Nothing, if you want to run through it, you should complete sometime before or during your run through Act 5, as it's a great little story in and of itself, but depending on the outcome of that DLC, which has multiple endings, you'll then encounter a fantastic boss fight that can play out a bit differently depending on your decisions there, which comes with its own rewards and items, etc. as usual. This one is not critical, I would say, to the main experience, but honestly I think that boss is incredibly cool and definitely worth it if you want a challenge, but otherwise it's pretty standalone. Then we have A Dance of Masks. This one takes place essentially right before you head off to the last act of the game or the final dungeon area. You need to have completed all the story critical stuff up to that point to even access it, and it serves as a bit of a last hurrah for all your companions. It's not really a combat focused DLC, though there is a little bit of story involved and things like that. It's more about spending time with the people you've grown attached to over the course of this very long game. And while it has other benefits, that's the main focus. So essentially, you'll want to have bought this one if you plan on actually finishing the title now that all the DLC is out, because it's a pretty critical piece of the experience, at least in my view, to really wrap things up and put a bow on it. And then we have the very last one. So Inevitable Excess takes place just before the last boss fight of the game, literally right before. And what's more, its campaign doesn't really have much to do with the main campaign even. So in terms of story, I would not say this one is necessary, and you would not be missing out on a ton of content by skipping it. However, if you plan on replaying the game multiple times, this one might be worth it, specifically because of all the rewards it can add to the main campaign on a follow-up playthrough. But because of what it takes to run through that DLC, because it's all at max level, it's not something I would recommend playing through before you run through your first playthrough, if that makes sense. Beyond those things, really the only consideration is simply the DLCs that add archetypes and classes. This is the Last Sarkorians, which adds the Shifter class, the Lord of Nothing, which adds 15 archetypes, and then of course the Dance of Masks, which adds another 11. But that has pretty much been everything there is to know about the DLCs, when to do them, what they add to the main game. So I certainly hope you found it informative. And I'd love to know what you think about these, or any experience you happen to really enjoy with the DLCs yourself, as we did rank them along the way. And I know that my personal favorite is a bit of an unconventional choice, as most people kind of hate that one if I'm being blunt about it. But otherwise, thanks for coming on this journey with me over the years as I reviewed each of these as they came out and saw what they added to the main game. It's been a real blast for me, so I'd love to hear what it was for you. But that is pretty much going to do it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.